The global macroeconomic landscape is currently undergoing a violent systemic reorganization. The foundational pillars of globalization, unimpeded international trade, and predictable monetary policy have been rapidly supplanted by acute geopolitical risk, fractured supply chains, and unprecedented domestic policy chaos. As of early March 2026, the financial markets are attempting to digest a confluence of historic events that are simultaneously striking the geopolitical, economic, and domestic political spheres. A world order that was for decades organized around geoeconomic integration has decisively shifted into an environment dictated by kinetic military conflict and protectionist legal battles. At the center of this paradigm shift is the direct military confrontation between the United States, Israel, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, a massive offensive officially designated as Operation Epic Fury. Initiated on February 28, 2026, this conflict has fundamentally upended the security architecture of the Middle East. More critically for the global economy, it has effectively severed the Strait of Hormuz, the world's most vital maritime energy choke point, triggering a massive supply-side shock to global crude oil and natural gas markets. Simultaneously, the United States is navigating a severe internal crisis. A landmark ruling by the United States Supreme Court has struck down billions of dollars in executive tariffs, creating a chaotic fiscal environment for multinational corporations and unleashing a torrent of legal and administrative turmoil regarding a mandated $166 billion refund process. This legal upheaval is occurring against the backdrop of a prolonged and paralyzing shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, which has severely degraded the nation's defensive posture at the exact moment international asymmetric threats are cresting. Within the financial markets, these geopolitical and domestic shocks are intersecting with a historic structural shift in equity valuations. The long dominant narrative surrounding artificial intelligence and the heavily concentrated Magnificent Seven megacap technology stocks is beginning to fracture under the weight of unsustainable capital expenditure and shifting macroeconomic winds. Institutional capital is now executing a massive rotation into equal weighted indices, value equities, and small cap sectors, fundamentally altering the risk reward calculus for global investors. This comprehensive report delivers an exhaustive multi-angle analysis of these intersecting crises. By deconstructing the narrative timelines, evaluating the core macroeconomic triggers, and assessing the intricate cause and effect relationships across global supply chains and equity markets, this analysis provides the essential context required to understand the immediate and long-term implications of the March 2026 global shockwave. The primary catalyst for the current global economic destabilization is the rapid and unprecedented escalation of military force in the Middle East. Following years of rising tensions regarding Iran's advancing nuclear program, the proliferation of ballistic missiles, and the regime's expanding military footprint across the region, diplomatic avenues were exhausted. The collapse of attempts to renegotiate the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, in 2025 set the stage for a kinetic resolution. Calculating that Iran was in a weakened state following years of crippling economic sanctions, domestic protests, and the degradation of its proxy networks during the 2025 regional conflicts, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28, 2026. The operational execution of the campaign was characterized by its overwhelming scale and precision targeting. Within the first 12 hours of the operation, the combined U.S.-Israeli military force conducted approximately 900 joint strikes, a number that swelled to roughly 2,000 strikes by the beginning of March. The strikes achieved their primary strategic decapitation objectives almost immediately. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in the very first wave of the aerial bombardment. This decapitation strike was accompanied by the targeted assassinations of the Iranian Army Chief of Staff, the Defense Minister, and multiple senior commanders within the elite Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC. To further paralyze the regime's institutional continuity, Israeli strikes systematically destroyed the complex designated for Iran's Assembly of Experts, effectively dismantling the body responsible for selecting a successor to the supreme leader. Beyond leadership decapitation, the military objectives rapidly expanded to encompass the systematic destruction of Iran's defense industrial base, its ballistic missile infrastructure, and its naval assets. The Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, intensely targeted critical manufacturing hubs, specifically the Shockwave industrial zone in Qom province and the Esteglal industrial zone in Tehran province. These industrial zones serve as the foundational nodes for Iran's extensive drone production networks. The strikes explicitly targeted the Oj Parvaz Mado Nafar Company, MADO, an entity previously sanctioned by the United States in 2021 for its role in reverse engineering foreign drone propulsion systems and supplying the engines utilized in the Shahed 131 and Shahed 136 unmanned aerial vehicles. Furthermore, Azmoun Pajohan Hezgar LLC, a firm deeply integrated with Iran's Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces Logistics, suffered catastrophic infrastructural damage. Despite the profound degradation of its senior leadership and industrial capacity, the Iranian regime mobilized a massive, region-wide retaliatory response. Iran launched thousands of drones and hundreds of ballistic missiles, targeting a broad array of assets across the Middle East. This retaliatory wave struck U.S. military bases in the region, Israeli infrastructure, and vital logistical and energy targets within neighboring Gulf Arab states. Air raid sirens have become a consistent feature across Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, while Saudi Arabian air defenses have been actively engaged in intercepting drones and missiles targeting both its domestic oil fields and air bases hosting American military personnel. The strategic complexity of this conflict is heavily compounded by the active, covert involvement of the world's major superpower adversaries. Intelligence reports indicate that the Russian Federation is actively sharing high-level intelligence with Iran to facilitate and optimize Iranian attacks against U.S. forces deployed in the Middle East. Because the heavily sanctioned Iranian regime lacks reliable access to high-quality, real-time satellite imagery, Russian intelligence sharing acts as a massive force multiplier for the IRGC's targeting and precision strike capabilities. Concurrently, multiple intelligence sources suggest that the People's Republic of China is actively preparing to provide Iran with emergency financial assistance and critical missile components necessary to sustain a prolonged conflict. This intervention transforms a localized regional war into a high-stakes proxy engagement involving the world's primary geopolitical rivals, drastically lowering the probability of a swift diplomatic resolution. While U.S. Central Command CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper reported a 90% decline in Iranian ballistic missile attacks by March 5th, indicating the tactical success of the U.S.-Israeli campaign in destroying launchers and domestic stockpiles, the Iranian strategic focus has decisively pivoted toward asymmetric warfare and maximum economic coercion. The most devastating and globally consequential vector of this asymmetric approach has been the targeted closure of global shipping lanes. Iran's ultimate asymmetric weapon and its most potent leverage over the stability of the global macroeconomic system lies in its geographic domination of the Strait of Hormuz. This incredibly narrow maritime choke point serves as the central artery for global energy markets, facilitating the passage of approximately 20% to 30% of the world's daily crude oil supply, alongside 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, LNG shipments. In a direct escalatory retaliatory move, a senior IRGC advisor declared on March 2nd that any commercial vessel attempting to navigate the strait would be considered a legitimate military target and attacked. The execution of this threat was both immediate and lethal. Iranian forces quickly utilized weaponized drone boats, aerial projectiles, and anti-ship missiles to strike commercial vessels navigating the region. Verified hits were claimed on the Honduras-flagged fuel tanker Athenova, while the oil tanker Skylight suffered a projectile strike that resulted in the tragic deaths of 2 Indian crew members. Additionally, the MKD Vyom suffered a catastrophic engine room explosion stemming from a drone boat attack, resulting in another sailor's death. The global maritime insurance industry reacted aggressively and definitively to these kinetic realities. Protection and indemnity, P&I, insurance clubs, which provide the essential liability coverage required for commercial shipping, formally pulled war risk cover for the Strait on March 5th, rendering the economic and legal risk of transit entirely prohibitive for ship owners. The Strait of Hormuz, the Gulf of Oman, and the broader Middle East Gulf were officially designated as warlike operations areas under international maritime crew contracts. This designation grants seafarers the explicit right to refuse to sail into the region and demand repatriation at their employer's expense. The resulting impact on shipping volumes was nothing short of catastrophic. Automatic Identification System, AIS, tracking data, which monitors global vessel movements, revealed that average daily vessel transits through the strait plummeted from a robust 153 ships prior to the conflict to effectively zero by early March. Over 150 massive tankers carrying crude oil, LNG, and refined petroleum products, representing roughly 4% of the entire global fleet by tonnage, were forced to drop anchor indefinitely outside the strait, waiting for a resolution that remains elusive. Major global shipping conglomerates, including Maersk, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, immediately suspended all transits through the Middle East corridors, citing unacceptable risks to human life and capital assets. To mitigate the massive financial impact of rerouting entire fleets and managing totally disrupted supply chains, shipping companies implemented severe emergency freight increases. Maersk, acting as a bellwether for the industry, levied staggering surcharges for cargo bound to or originating from unaffected ports in the broader region. The effective military blockade of the strait has choked off vital energy exports from some of the world's most prolific producers, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar. Because oil cannot be shipped, domestic storage facilities across the Gulf rapidly reached their absolute maximum physical capacity. Consequently, regional producers were forced into emergency operational shutdowns. Iraq initiated severe shutdowns at the massive Rumaila oil field, one of the largest globally, while Qatar completely halted its LNG production, which historically accounts for 20% of global LNG exports, and declared formal force majeure on its international contracts, warning that prolonged conflict could bring down economies of the world. In a desperate attempt to signal stability to panicking global markets, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries and its allies, OPEC+, convened an emergency session. The Voluntary Eight, V8 group within the alliance, announced a production adjustment, increasing output quotas by 206,000 barrels per day, BPD, scheduled for implementation in April. This physical quota increase exceeded market expectations, which had forecast a more modest 137,000 BPD increment. However, energy analysts and macro strategists widely view this physical production hike as practically irrelevant to the immediate structural crisis. As thoroughly noted by analysts at Rystad Energy, the overwhelming majority of OPEC's spare production capacity is heavily concentrated in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. If these additional barrels cannot physically move through the blockaded Strait of Hormuz, increased production targets exist only on paper and cannot alleviate physical global shortages. In the current environment, logistics and transit risk have entirely eclipsed theoretical production capacity as the primary driver of market pricing. To circumvent the blockade, Saudi Arabia has desperately begun redirecting its crude exports via the domestic east-west pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. While this maneuver provides a partial vital release valve for the kingdom's exports, the pipeline's maximum capacity is vastly insufficient to replace the sheer volume of seaborne transport historically facilitated by the Strait of Hormuz. The global energy supply chain remains structurally broken. The dual shocks of Middle Eastern warfare and the subsequent energy crisis have deeply fractured global transport and logistics infrastructure, extending far beyond maritime shipping. the global aviation industry is currently absorbing some of the most immediate physical, operational, and financial impacts of the conflict. The closure of vast swathes of Middle Eastern airspace, combined with the extreme spike in global crude oil benchmarks, has driven aviation operating costs to levels not witnessed since the initial inflationary shocks of the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022. The spot cost of jet fuel in Northwest Europe surged violently, reaching approximately $1,159.75 per metric ton by early March. Because aviation fuel is the lifeblood of the industry, typically constituting 20% to 30% of an airline's total operational expenses, this rapid, unhedged price escalation is actively destroying airline profit margins. US-based commercial carriers are particularly vulnerable in this environment, as they generally refrain from executing extensive long-term fuel hedging programs, leaving their balance sheets directly exposed to spot market volatility. Credit rating agencies, most notably S&P Global, have already issued dire warnings that persistently elevated fuel prices will inevitably lead to widespread credit quality downgrades across the entire global transportation sector, particularly considering that consumer ticket prices were already highly elevated prior to the crisis. Operational logistics for global aviation have been similarly devastated. The Middle East serves as the critical, irreplaceable connective corridor between European and Asian air traffic. The sudden airspace closures forced the immediate chaotic suspension of operations by major Gulf megacarriers including Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar Airways, stranding hundreds of thousands of international passengers, while Emirates attempted a highly publicized partial restart of operations by March 7th, aiming to service 60% of its network across 83 destinations. The physical fragility of the routing remains exceptionally high, and insurance premiums for operating in the region have skyrocketed. Furthermore, dedicated global cargo airlines face severe, almost insurmountable restrictions. Cargolux, one of the world's premier pure-breed cargo carriers, was forced to cancel essentially all flights to and from the Middle East, maintaining a tenuous service only to Muscat, Oman. The paralysis of global air freight capacity has shifted immense, unmanageable pressure onto the ocean freight sector. However, the ocean freight sector is itself crippled by the Strait of Hormuz closure and the persistent simultaneous military disruptions in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. With both major Middle Eastern maritime choke points effectively impassable, the global supply chain is experiencing a severe compounding bottleneck that guarantees elevated freight rates and delayed delivery schedules for the foreseeable future. The geopolitical severing of vital energy arteries has triggered profound macroeconomic shocks that threaten to derail the global economy. The immediate financial manifestation of the crisis was a violent surge in global crude oil benchmarks, entirely unmooring previous inflation expectations. Brent crude prices, which were trading in a relatively stable 70-75 range prior to the escalation, experienced an immediate 10% to 13% jump in early trading, surging to $80-85 per barrel, and eventually peaking at a painful $92 per barrel. West Texas Intermediate WTI crude aggressively tested its 2025 highs, pushing deep into the $78-80 zone. Technical analysts note that a sustained close above the $80 threshold opens the potential to target 2023 highs near $90, with a very real possibility of revisiting the $100 psychological threshold if the blockade persists. This severe energy price shock fundamentally alters the global inflation trajectory. Central banks worldwide, particularly the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England, are now staring down the highly undesirable specter of stagflation, a paralyzing economic condition characterized by a prolonged period of stagnant economic growth coupled with stubbornly high, deeply entrenched inflation. The distribution of this economic pain will be highly asymmetrical across the globe. Net energy importers located in East Asia, specifically China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, are severely exposed. A staggering 78% of their Middle Eastern crude imports rely exclusively on safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Despite Beijing's repeated diplomatic calls to keep the strait open for international trade, verified ship tracking data confirms that Chinese tanker fleets have entirely ceased operations in the area. This data highlights a critical geopolitical reality. China possesses a highly limited strategic and naval capacity to protect its own commercial interests in the Persian Gulf. European nations heavily dependent on imported energy, particularly industrial powerhouses like Germany and the UK, also face massive recessionary pressures as input costs skyrocket. Conversely, net energy exporters located entirely outside the conflict zone, namely Norway, Canada, and the Russian Federation, stand to reap massive financial windfalls from the artificially inflated price of crude. The United States occupies a highly unique bifurcated position. Propelled over the last decade by the shale revolution, the U.S. is now a modest net exporter of energy. While everyday American households will undoubtedly experience a painful financial squeeze from surging retail fuel prices, the broader macroeconomic data suggests significant domestic resilience. Approximately 87% of U.S. GDP has been expanding consistently at a 2% to 3% annual rate over the last few years, and underlying corporate productivity metrics remain surprisingly robust. However, the Federal Reserve's monetary policy calculus has been severely complicated, if not entirely upended. The prices paid component of the ISM Services Index hit its highest level since June 2022, signaling that underlying input costs were rising rapidly even before the Middle East escalation. The Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, recently downgraded its median 2025 GDP growth forecast to a sluggish 1.7%, while simultaneously revising its core PCE inflation forecast upward to a concerning 2.8%. Fed officials explicitly note the rising upside risk to inflation and the mounting downside risk to economic growth, indicating that the previously anticipated path to aggressive interest rate cuts has been substantially narrowed, or perhaps blocked entirely for the calendar year. While external shocks violently buffet the global economy, severe internal political and legal dysfunction within the United States is deeply compounding the crisis. The U.S. government and the corporate sector are currently navigating a chaotic unraveling of executive trade policy. On February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court issued a historic 6-3 ruling that definitively struck down President Donald Trump's sweeping Liberation Day tariffs. These tariffs, which had imposed massive import taxes ranging from 10% to 50% on goods from nearly all U.S. trading partners, had acted as a massive, unpredictable frictional cost on global supply chains for the preceding year. The Supreme Court ruled that the administration had vastly exceeded its constitutional authority by relying on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, of 1977 to implement blanket global taxation. Invoking the powerful major questions doctrine, the court determined that the executive branch cannot utilize ambiguous, broad statutory language meant for national emergencies to assume the core, constitutionally mandated congressional power of taxation and the purse. The majority opinion explicitly noted that the president enjoys absolutely no inherent authority to impose peacetime tariffs without clear, specific congressional authorization. The immediate practical consequence of this landmark ruling is an administrative and fiscal nightmare of unprecedented proportions. Under the now illegal IEEPA tariffs, the federal government had unlawfully collected an estimated $166 billion from more than 330,000 American businesses across 53 million separate import entries. The U.S. Court of International Trade, overseen by Judge Richard Eaton, has subsequently mandated that U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, utilize its existing electronic systems to process mass refunds, complete with accrued interest, within a highly compressed 45-day window. Judge Eaton explicitly ordered CBP to leverage its standard liquidation process, finalizing the entry cost of millions of historical shipments without the illegal tariff assessed, thereby triggering automatic refunds and bypassing the catastrophic scenario of 330,000 individual corporate lawsuits clogging the federal judiciary. While this $166 billion liquidity injection back into the corporate sector may provide a massive temporary stimulus for small and medium-sized enterprises, the broader regulatory uncertainty remains absolute. In direct defiance of the spirit of the Supreme Court ruling, the administration immediately pivoted to enact a new 10% to 15% global baseline tariff. This time, the administration invoked Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a statute which permits temporary import surcharges for a maximum of 150 days, specifically to address severe balance of payments deficits. This aggressive maneuver has triggered an immediate massive counter-lawsuit from a powerful coalition of 24 Democratic attorneys, general, and governors. This coalition argues that Section 122 was designed for outdated monetary crises from the 1970s, not for blanket, punitive protectionism. For multinational corporations and global supply chain logistics planners, the sheer inability to forecast basic import tax liabilities over a standard fiscal quarter constitutes a massive drag on forward guidance, capital expenditure planning, and international hiring. Adding profound risk to the economic and trade chaos is the ongoing politically driven paralysis of the United States domestic security apparatus. As the kinetic war with Iran escalates abroad, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, has entered its third, stretching into its fourth week, of a total funding lapse, the result of a severe partisan gridlock over immigration enforcement policy and deportation tactics. The operational consequences of this shutdown are highly material, specifically in the context of the Middle East conflict. The Iranian regime and its sprawling network of proxy militias possesses a highly documented history of directing asymmetric warfare, sophisticated cyber attacks, and targeted assassination plots against U.S. interests globally. Following the U.S. strikes in Iran, the DHS and state authorities issued severe national warnings regarding the heightened, immediate risk of lone wolf terrorism and cyber warfare directed at the U.S. homeland. These theoretical fears materialized violently in Austin, Texas. Over the weekend, a Senegalese immigrant, reportedly wearing clothing bearing Iranian flag designs and motivated by support for the Iranian regime, opened fire on a local establishment, killing 2 Americans and wounding 14. The FBI is currently investigating this mass casualty event as a lone wolf terror attack, acting as direct retaliation for Operation Epic Fury. Despite this elevated active threat matrix, the agencies most critical to defending the homeland are operating at severely degraded capacities. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, explicitly tasked with protecting the highly vulnerable U.S. energy grid, financial networks, and water facilities from Iranian cyber intrusion, currently has the vast majority of its 2,000-person workforce furloughed, operating with a skeleton crew of only 800 employees. Routine, vital assessments designed to detect critical infrastructure vulnerabilities have been indefinitely canceled. Furthermore, Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, the premier federal law enforcement agency combating transnational illicit activity and terror financing, is heavily restricted. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has halted all non-disaster related response efforts, and over 50,000 Transportation Security Administration, TSA, agents are missing paychecks. This political impasse over immigration policy has effectively crippled the nation's defensive posture at the precise moment geopolitical retaliatory risk has peaked. We are witnessing the collision of kinetic warfare, asymmetric maritime blockades, and profound domestic political dysfunction. In this new era, passive reliance on tech concentration and uninterrupted global trade has definitively ended. Investors and corporations must now navigate an environment where geopolitical risk analysis is the primary driver of asset valuation, and where physical security of energy, supply chains, and infrastructure dictates ultimate economic survival.